Vampire King Aldrich Vaylor watched the ornate carriage roll through the obsidian gates of Blackthorn Keep, and for the first time in 3 centuries, he felt something close to dread. This couldn't be his bride. A mistake had been made, surely. Mortal women sent to marry vampire kings came trembling and pale, easily compelled, quickly forgotten. Yet she emerged from the carriage with unhurried grace, golden hair catching the eerie glow of blue lantern fire, and when her eyes found him across the courtyard, she spoke 5 words that made every immortal present go utterly still. "You summoned a bride. Here I am." His council had selected a simple village girl, someone forgettable who would smile during ceremonies and disappear into the castle's shadows. Instead, they had delivered Lyra Valemont, a woman who radiated something his ancient senses couldn't name, something that made the air itself seem to bend around her presence. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And stay with me until the very end, because what happens when a vampire king meets a bride who cannot be controlled will change everything you think you know about power, prophecy, and the price of defiance. The November twilight hung heavy over Umberhell, that threshold hour when the living world exhaled its last breath and the kingdom of night drew its first. Cold wind swept across the courtyard of Blackthorn Keep, carrying with it the scent of iron and ancient stone, and the distant howl of something that was neither wolf nor wind. Aldrich stood motionless on the carved platform, his crimson eyes fixed on the approaching carriage, his jaw set in that particular way immortals have when they're about to endure something tedious. He was old, so old that mortal years meant nothing anymore, though if pressed, he might admit to 347 winters since his turning. His face held the sharp, predatory beauty common to his kind, pale as moonlight, features aristocratic and severe, silver-white hair falling past broad shoulders clad in black velvet and silver embroidery. He stood well over 6 feet, moving with the controlled stillness of an apex predator, but there was something in the set of his shoulders, a weariness that came from ruling too long without purpose. Behind him, 3 figures watched with varying degrees of tension. Lord Cashendreven, the court's empathic advisor, his dark eyes troubled. Marshal Rowan Thorne, hand resting casually near his concealed blade. And Elric Vaylor, Aldrich's cousin and keeper of forbidden texts, his expression carefully blank in that way meant he was hiding something significant. The kingdom needed stability. That was the council's reasoning, delivered in the same tedious tones they used for every political necessity. 500 years since a queen sat beside the night throne. Too long. The noble houses grew restless. Border territories questioned his authority. And so, like some medieval arrangement, they had selected a bride from the mortal territories, a girl from a village whose name Aldrich hadn't bothered to remember. He'd agreed because ruling alone had become exhausting in ways even immortality couldn't cure. 20 years since he'd lost Seraphine to the Dawn sickness. 30 since his most trusted general fell in the border wars. And Aldrich had been maintaining Umberhell alone ever since, a kingdom of shadows and secrets, of blood oaths and ancient pacts, of beauty so terrible it could make mortals weep. None of it mattered when you returned each night to chambers so silent that even your own footsteps sounded like accusations. He'd tried other solutions, taken lovers who bore him within weeks, elevated advisors who proved ambitious or incompetent. The few vampire women of appropriate station were either bound to rival houses or had made clear that Aldrich Vaylor, for all his power and ancient bloodline, was too cold, too distant, too haunted by whatever ghosts he'd accumulated across 3 centuries of existence. They weren't wrong. So 3 months ago, after another season of council pressure and another failed negotiation with the Eastern Territories, Aldrich had done what he'd sworn he'd never do. He'd allowed his council to select a bride, keeping his requirements minimal and practical in that way immortals have when they're trying not to reveal how little they care. Mortal. Young enough to be shaped. Healthy enough to survive the bonding ceremony. Unremarkable enough not to draw attention. The council had chosen carefully, they assured him. A girl from a farming village, the daughter of a miller, chosen for her obedience and her family's desperate need for the gold such an arrangement provided. Forgettable, controllable, perfect. The carriage door opened, and Aldrich felt the first whisper of wrongness. The woman who stepped onto the platform was not forgettable. She moved with a certainty that made his oldest instincts flare, the ones that had kept him alive through wars and betrayals and the long centuries of court intrigue. Golden hair, simply braided. Travel-worn dress in muted blue. No jewels, no cosmetics. Nothing to enhance what nature had already rendered striking. But it wasn't her beauty that made Cassian inhale sharply, or Rowan's hand drift toward his weapon, or Elric take an involuntary step backward. It was the way she looked at them. Not with fear. Not with the glazed submission of the compelled. Not even with the brave-faced terror most mortals wore in the presence of predators. She looked at Aldrich the way one monarch might regard another across a battlefield, with assessment, with challenge, with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was walking into. The courtyard had gone absolutely silent. Even the horses stamped nervously in their traces. Lyra Valemont, if that was even her real name, crossed the space between carriage and king with measured steps, and when she was close enough that he could smell the peculiar scent that clung to her, sunlight and something else, something that made his fangs ache, she inclined her head in a gesture that was neither bow nor submission. "You summoned a bride," she said, her voice low and steady. "Here I am." And Aldrich Vaylor, who had stared down demons and rival kings, who had walked through fire and emerged unburned, felt his carefully constructed indifference crack like ice under spring sun. This was not the bride they had chosen. He was certain of it. And as Cassian's shocked whisper reached his ear, "My king, I cannot read her emotions," followed by Elric's barely audible gasp of recognition, Aldrich realized with cold, crystalline clarity that something had gone very, very wrong. Or perhaps, for the first time in centuries, something had gone exactly right. He looked at the woman standing before him, at the way faint symbols seemed to shimmer in the air around her, visible only to those with ancient sight, and felt the first stirrings of something he'd thought long dead. Curiosity, anticipation, and beneath it all, a thread of fear he couldn't quite name. "Welcome to Blackthorn Keep," he heard himself say, his voice colder than he intended. "Though I suspect you are not who my council expected." Her lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Then we have something in common, Your Majesty. You are not what I expected either." Behind him, Rowan's blade whispered free of its sheath, just barely. Cassian placed a restraining hand on the marshal's arm. And Elric stared at Lyra with the expression of a scholar who'd just seen a myth step out of a forbidden text and demand an audience. The grand hall of Blackthorn Keep stretched before Lyra like the throat of some vast stone creature. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into shadow despite the hundreds of candles burning in iron chandeliers. Tapestries depicting battles she didn't recognize hung between arched windows that showed only darkness beyond. And everywhere, leaning against pillars, gathered in clusters near the massive fireplace, seated on benches carved from black wood, were vampires. They watched her enter with the focused stillness of predators assessing prey. Lyra kept her chin level, her pace measured. She'd prepared for this moment, rehearsed it during the 3-week journey from her village. Show no fear. Reveal nothing. Survive long enough to understand what she'd walked into. But preparation, she was learning, meant nothing when whispers moved through an immortal court like poison through water. She doesn't smell of compulsion. Look at her posture. She's been trained. The king cannot read her. Did you see his face? Perhaps she's touched by the light magic. The forbidden kind. Lyra's fingers tightened imperceptibly on the simple traveling bag she carried. They were wrong about some things, right about others, and she couldn't afford to let them know which was which. Cassian Dreven moved with practiced grace to walk beside her, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that should have been intimate, but felt clinical. He was beautiful in the way all vampires seemed to be, ageless, refined, dangerous, but there was something gentler in his features, something almost human in the concern that creased his brow. "Forgive the discourtesy of our introduction," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she would hear. I am Lord Cashin, advisor to King Aldrich. Normally, I would welcome a guest with more warmth, but you have unsettled us. I apologize for existing incorrectly, Lyra replied, the words escaping before she could reconsider them. Cashin's lips twitched. You're afraid. I can sense that much. But the fear is... He paused, and for the first time since entering the hall, she saw genuine confusion on an immortal face. It's contained, controlled, as if you've built walls inside your own mind. How is that possible for an untrained mortal? Lyra met his gaze. Perhaps your assumptions about mortals are incomplete, Lord Cashin. Before he could respond, a hand fell on her shoulder. Firm, territorial. Rowan Thorne, the marshal, had the build of a warrior and the eyes of someone who'd seen too many betrayals to trust easily. Silver scars traced his jawline, visible even against his pale skin. I'll take her from here, Rowan said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. He guided Lyra away from Cashin with barely concealed urgency, his grip just short of painful. You're either very brave or very foolish, mortal. Which is it? Does it matter? Lyra asked as they moved through a side corridor lined with ancient weapons. It matters to me. I'm responsible for the king's safety, which means I'm responsible for identifying threats. His crimson eyes bored into her. And you, Lyra Valemont, if that's even your real name, are the most threatening mortal I've seen in 3 decades. I'm just a woman who accepted a summons. Just a woman. Rowan stopped walking, forcing her to face him. Just a woman who stands like she's trained for combat. Who doesn't flinch when immortals bare their fangs. Who walks into a castle of predators as if she belongs here. He leaned closer, voice dropping to something that could have been a threat or a warning. What are you really? For a heartbeat, Lyra considered telling him. Consider explaining about the village girl she'd replaced, sweet Mara with her simple dreams and innocent smile, who would have died within a week in this place. Considered revealing the real reason she'd taken Mara's place, the weight of a debt she could never explain, the blood legacy she barely understood herself. Instead, she said, I'm exactly what your king asked for. A bride. Whether he keeps me is his decision. Not yours, Marshal. Rowan's expression darkened, but before he could respond, they reached a heavy oak door. He knocked once, then pushed it open without waiting for permission. Aldrich Vaylor stood by the window of what appeared to be a private study, his silver hair catching moonlight like spilled mercury. He'd removed his formal cloak, and in the simpler black tunic and fitted trousers, he looked less like a king and more like what he truly was, a predator taking its ease before the hunt. Leave us, Aldrich said without turning. Rowan hesitated. My king. I will be perfectly safe with a mortal woman, Rowan. Go. The door closed with a finality that made Lyra's pulse quicken. She'd been alone with dangerous men before, but never one who could kill her with casual ease, whose very existence defied the natural order she'd grown up believing in. Aldrich turned slowly, and the full weight of his attention made something in her chest tighten. Not fear exactly, but recognition. As if some part of her had been waiting for this moment. My council selected a miller's daughter from a village called Thornhaven, he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet that demanded truth. Her name was Mara Whitfield. Brown hair, brown eyes, 17 years old. Enthusiastic letters. Simple requests. He tilted his head, crimson eyes narrowing. You are not her. Lyra had prepared for this too. Mara Whitfield accepted your gold and decided she preferred a merchant's son in the next valley. I needed to leave my village quickly. We made an arrangement. And Lyra Valemont is your real name? It's the name I've carried for 26 years. That's not the same as answering my question. She met his gaze without wavering. With respect, Your Majesty, you didn't summon me for my bloodline. You summoned a bride who could fulfill political necessity. I can do that, regardless of whether my family name is inscribed in your council's records. Something flickered in Aldrich's expression, surprise, perhaps, or grudging respect. You're educated, more than a simple village girl should be. My father kept books. I learned to read them. And to fight, apparently. Rowan noticed your stance. My father also believed women should know how to defend themselves. How convenient. A father who taught you everything you'd need to survive in a vampire court. Aldrich moved closer, and Lyra forced herself not to retreat. Tell me, Lyra Valemont, what are you running from? The question struck closer to the truth than he could know. Lyra thought of the dreams that had plagued her since childhood, visions of light and shadow, of battles fought before she was born, of voices calling her name in languages she shouldn't understand. She thought of the way mirrors sometimes showed symbols glowing faintly on her skin, visible for only a heartbeat before vanishing. She thought of the elderly woman who'd found her after her parents' death, who'd whispered warnings about bloodlines and prophecies before disappearing into the night. The same thing every woman runs from, she said quietly. A life that was chosen for me instead of by me. Aldrich studied her with an intensity that felt invasive, as if he could peel back her words and find the truth beneath. And perhaps he could. She knew so little about what vampires could truly do. Finally, he spoke. You're hiding something. Multiple things. But I cannot determine if you're a threat or simply desperate. He returned to the window, dismissing her with a gesture. You'll stay in the East Wing under guard. We'll continue this conversation after I've had time to investigate your claims. And the marriage arrangement? Is postponed until I understand what exactly my council has brought into my castle. Lyra should have felt relief. Instead, she felt only the certainty that time was running out faster than either of them realized. The study door burst open. Elric Valer stood in the threshold, his face paler than usual, an ancient tome clutched against his chest. His eyes found Aldrich first, then shifted to Lyra with something that looked horrifyingly like recognition. Cousin, Elric said, his voice trembling slightly. We need to speak.
Now.
About the lumen-bound prophecy. His gaze locked on Lyra. It has begun. The east wing of Blackthorn Keep was beautiful in the way a blade was beautiful, elegant, cold, and designed to cut. Lyra stood at the window of her assigned chambers, watching the moonlit kingdom stretch into darkness beyond the castle walls. Umbrahel at night looked like a painting rendered entirely in silver and shadow, forests of black pine, distant mountains crowned with perpetual storms, and winding roads that seemed to lead nowhere mortals should venture. She'd been confined here for 2 days while Aldrich's council debated her fate. 2 days of servants who wouldn't meet her eyes, of meals delivered in silence, of awareness that she was being watched even when the corridors appeared empty. But Lyra had never been good at staying confined. The castle revealed itself in stolen moments, early mornings when she slipped past her drowsy guard, twilight hours when the vampires were occupied with their own mysterious rituals. She learned the architecture of shadows, how the western towers spiraled toward chambers that smelled of ancient parchment and dried blood, how the southern galleries displayed portraits of nobles whose eyes seemed to track her movement, how the central courtyard featured a fountain carved from obsidian that never reflected anything but darkness, even under direct moonlight. The vampires themselves were a study in contradictions. They moved with predatory grace, yet observed elaborate courtesies. They spoke in whispers that carried like shouts. And whenever Lyra passed, they did something that disturbed her more than outright hostility. They stepped back. Not in fear, but in something close to reverence, or perhaps superstition. She'd caught fragments of their speculation. Can't be coincidence that she arrived during the dark moon. Heard Cashin couldn't read her emotions at all, not even surface feelings. My grandmother spoke of women like her, before the purge. Either the best weapon the mortals have sent us, or the worst mistake the council has made. Lyra didn't know which possibility frightened her more. In the war room at the castle's heart, Aldrich faced his council across a table carved from a single piece of midnight stone. Maps of Umbrahel's territories covered the surface, marked with symbols that denoted both holdings and threats. The eastern border lords are already asking questions, Lord Vask said, his scarred features grim. They want to know why you've delayed the bonding ceremony. Because I won't bind myself to a woman I don't understand, Aldrich replied, his voice carefully neutral. Not even for political stability. Then you risk appearing weak, Lady Mirren countered, her silver eyes sharp. Or worse, manipulated. There are those who would use any sign of hesitation to suggest you've lost control. Marshal Rowan leaned forward. The Shadowfen faction has already sent riders. They claim the mortal's arrival is a sign that the king has forsaken pure vampire bloodlines. His jaw tightened. They're calling for a formal challenge to your authority. Aldrich's hands flattened on the table, the only outward sign of his frustration. 3 centuries of rule, and it came down to this. One mortal woman threatening to unravel everything he'd built. The Shadowfen can challenge all they like, he said coldly. But they'll do so through proper channels, not rebellious whispers. Increase patrols on their territories. And send word that any move against the mortal bride will be considered an act of treason against the crown. So you're claiming her, Elric said quietly from his position near the window. Despite not knowing what she is, I'm protecting her until I do know. There's a difference. The training yard occupied a courtyard carved into the castle's northern flank, where the mountain's shadow fell deepest. Lyra found it by following the sound of clashing steel and shouted commands. She paused at the archway, watching Rowan drill a company of vampire soldiers through combat forms that were both familiar and alien, recognizable techniques executed with inhuman speed and precision. Rowan spotted her immediately. Come to observe how real warriors train, he called out, his voice carrying that same edge of challenge she'd heard before. Something like that, Lyra replied, stepping into the yard. He gestured to his soldiers to continue, then approached with the controlled movement of a man who was always half a heartbeat from violence. Your stance gave you away in the hall. Let's see if it was training or an accident. Without warning, he tossed her a practice blade. Lyra's hand moved on instinct, catching the weapon and shifting her weight in the same motion. The balance was wrong, too heavy, designed for vampire strength, but her grip adjusted automatically, finding the proper hold. Rowan's eyes narrowed. You've been trained. I told you. My father believed. No village father teaches that kind of reflex. He moved closer, forcing her to either retreat or stand firm. She held her ground. That's a combat-ready stance. Military trained. Who taught you? The truthful answer, I don't remember. The knowledge simply appeared one day like muscle memory from someone else's life, would only invite more questions she couldn't answer. Does it matter? Lyra countered. You've already decided I'm a threat. I've decided you're dangerous. Whether that makes you a threat depends on your intentions. He took the blade back, but his scrutiny didn't waver. The king may be willing to wait for answers. I'm not that patient. Cashin found her in the castle's conservatory that evening, a glass-roofed chamber where night-blooming flowers grew in impossible profusion. He approached with the careful courtesy of someone who understood she'd had enough of intimidation. They're called shadow blooms, he said, gesturing to the dark purple flowers that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. They only grow where magic has soaked into the soil. Legend says they feed on secrets. Lyra touched one delicate petal. Then they must thrive here. Indeed. Cashin settled on a stone bench, his expression troubled. You should understand what you've walked into. Umbrahel is not just a kingdom, it's a balance. Between the old vampire houses and the new. Between tradition and necessity. Between darkness and... He paused. And the memory of light. Light. There were once mortals who carried light as we carried shadow. Centuries ago, before the Purge. They were feared, hunted, and destroyed. His dark eyes met hers. Elric believes you may be descended from them. The words settled over Lyra like a shroud. That's impossible. Is it? You who cannot be compelled, who makes ancient vampires recoil, whose very presence disturbs the court. Cashin's voice was gentle. I sense emotions, Lyra. It's my gift and my curse. And when I try to sense yours, I don't feel anything. I feel walls. Ancient walls, built by power I don't recognize. In his private study, Elric spread the ancient tome before Aldrich with trembling hands. The text was written in Old Umbran, the language that predated even the vampire kingdoms. "The lumen bound," Elric read, translating as he went. "She who carries the dawn in her blood shall come to the night throne in the hour of shadow's deepest hunger. Neither pride nor conqueror, neither savior or destroyer, but the key that turns the lock between worlds." He looked up, his expression grave. "There's more, but the prophecy is fragmented. What's clear is that her arrival signals a choice point, for you, for the kingdom, perhaps for all of Umberhell." Aldrich stared at the incomprehensible text. "And if I send her away?" "The prophecy doesn't say." "But, cousin." Elric's voice dropped. "I saw the symbols in her aura. The same ones depicted here, in texts written 500 years before her birth. She is what the prophecy names, whether she knows it or not." That night, alone in her chambers, Lyra felt it for the first time, a warmth blooming in her chest like a trapped star trying to break free. It lasted only a heartbeat, leaving her breathless and shaking, but in that moment she saw light behind her closed eyelids, golden, fierce, and completely terrifying. She pressed her hand to her sternum, feeling her racing pulse. "What am I?" In the throne room, Aldrich made his decision. "Send word to the council. The marriage ceremony is postponed indefinitely. I will not bond with a woman who may be a weapon aimed at my kingdom's heart." "And if she is not a weapon?" Cassian asked quietly. "Then we'll discover that together." Aldrich's voice carried the weight of centuries. One way or another. High on the northern parapet, a figure watched Lyra's window through the darkness. They noted which chamber she'd been given, observed the rotation of her guards, counted the hours until the watch changed. And when they'd seen enough, they disappeared into shadow with the practiced ease of someone who'd been watching and waiting for far longer than anyone in the castle suspected. Aldrich summoned her on the third morning, not to his study, but to the throne room itself, a calculated choice designed to remind her of the power and balance between them. The vast chamber stretched like a cathedral of darkness, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadow, its walls lined with the banners of noble houses that had sworn fealty over centuries. And at its center, carved from obsidian veined with silver, sat the Night Throne. Lyra entered to find him seated there, every inch the immortal king. He dressed for the occasion, black velvet embroidered with silver thread that caught the candlelight, a crown of twisted metal that looked more like thorns than precious metal, and an expression of such cold authority that it could have frozen blood. "Approach," he commanded, his voice echoing through the empty hall. She walked forward without hesitation, refusing to show intimidation even as her pulse quickened. When she reached the steps below the throne, she stopped but did not kneel. "You summoned me, Your Majesty." "I did." Aldrich leaned forward, crimson eyes boring into her. "We're going to have a conversation, Lyra Valemont, and this time I expect complete honesty. Not the carefully crafted half-truths you've been offering, but the truth. I've told you nothing but the truth. You've told me facts wrapped in omission. There's a difference." He descended the steps with predatory grace, circling her slowly. "You claim your father taught you to read, to fight, to stand before immortals without trembling. Convenient skills for a village girl. You claim you replaced another bride out of necessity, yet you've never explained what necessity drove you. And you claim the name Valemont as if it should mean nothing, when my scholars can find no record of your family anywhere in the mortal territories." Each accusation landed like a blade testing armor. Lyra turned to keep him in her sight, matching his circling movement. "Perhaps your records are incomplete. My records spanned 3 centuries. They are not incomplete." He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the inhuman stillness of his chest. No breath, no heartbeat, nothing but ancient power contained in flesh. "What are you hiding?" "The same things you're hiding, Your Majesty." The words escaped before caution could stop them. "Or do you pretend that the crown doesn't weigh heavier than metal? That the throne isn't a cage you've locked yourself into?" The silence that followed felt dangerous. Aldrich's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of someone who'd seen past his carefully constructed walls. "You overstep. You asked for honesty." Lyra held her ground, even as instinct screamed to retreat. I can offer you facts about my past, but they won't tell you what you really want to know. You want to understand why I unsettle your court, why prophecies wake at my arrival, why I can't be compelled. She paused. The truth is, I don't understand it myself. But I do understand what it means to wear a mask until you forget the face beneath it. For a long moment, Aldrich simply stared at her. Then, unexpectedly, his lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. You're either very brave or very foolish. I haven't decided which. I've been told they're often the same thing. By your mysterious father? By experience. Something shifted between them then. Not trust exactly, but a grudging acknowledgement that they were both playing roles neither had chosen. Aldrich gestured toward the throne room's side exit.
Come.
If we're to be honest with each other, we shouldn't do it in a room designed for performances. She followed him through corridors she hadn't seen before, to a chamber overlooking the castle's inner courtyard. Below, she could see vampires going about their evening routines, servants preparing for night markets, guards changing shifts, and, unexpectedly, a small group of mortal workers carrying supplies. You keep mortals here, Lyra observed. 12 families by choice. They maintain the gardens, tend the livestock, handle daylight repairs we cannot. Aldrich watched them with an expression that surprised her. Not contempt, but something closer to responsibility. They're paid fairly, protected completely, and free to leave if they wish. Most have been here for generations. As they watched, a young mortal boy dropped a basket, spilling apples across the courtyard. A vampire noble nearby started forward, irritation clear on his face, but Aldrich opened the window and called down in a voice that carried clear authority. Lord Davin, I believe the child could use assistance, not rebuke. The noble's posture shifted immediately from aggression to grudging courtesy. He helped the boy gather the apples, even offering what looked like a genuine smile. You protect them, Lyra said softly. They're under my authority. That means they're my responsibility. Aldrich glanced at her. You look surprised. I don't know what I expected, but not fairness. We're predators, not monsters. There's a difference, though mortals rarely see it. He closed the window. The strong have obligations to the weak, or strength becomes mere tyranny. It's a lesson many of my kind have forgotten. Before Lyra could respond, raised voices echoed from a distant corridor. Aldrich's expression darkened. Stay here. But Lyra had never been good at following orders. She trailed him through a maze of passages until they reached the old Eastern Tower, the section she'd been explicitly warned to avoid. The voices grew louder, accompanied by a scent that made her stomach turn, blood and rot, and something worse. The chamber they entered was chaotic. A rogue vampire, one of the turned who'd lost themselves to bloodlust, had cornered 2 servants against the far wall. Its eyes were pure black, its fangs extended, its movements jerky and wrong. Get back, Aldrich commanded, but the creature was beyond hearing. It lunged toward the terrified servants. Lyra moved without thinking, putting herself between predator and prey. The rogue vampire's claws caught her shoulder, tearing fabric and skin, and in that instant of pain and adrenaline, something in her chest exploded outward, light, pure and golden, flooding the chamber with radiance that made the rogue shriek and recoil. The burst lasted only a heartbeat before vanishing, leaving Lyra gasping and the rogue vampire fleeing into shadow. Aldrich caught her as her knees buckled, his strong arms steady despite the shock evident on his face.
What was that? He demanded.
I don't know, Lyra whispered, and for the first time since arriving, she meant it completely. Marshal Rowan appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. He took in the scene with a soldier's practiced eye, Lyra's torn shoulder, the fleeing rogue, and the fading afterglow of light that still seemed to shimmer in the air. I saw it, he said quietly. The light. It came from her. Later, after healers had tended Lyra's wound and the terrified servants had been relocated, Cashin found Aldrich in his private chambers. You're growing attached to her, Cashin said without preamble. I can feel it. Every time you're near her, your emotional shields crack just slightly. I'm protecting a guest. You're protecting someone you're beginning to care about. There's a difference. Cashin's dark eyes held concern, not judgment. Be careful, cousin. Prophecy or not, power or not, she's mortal. And you've mourned mortal losses before. Aldrich stared into the fireplace. I know.
Do you?
Because from where I stand, you're already defending her to the council, defying centuries of tradition to keep her safe, and looking at her as if she might be the answer to questions you stopped asking decades ago. Cashin's voice gentled. I just don't want to watch you break again. In her chambers, Lyra found a note slipped under her door. The parchment was fine quality, the writing elegant, but unsigned. The light-bearer does not belong among shadows. Leave before the dark moon ends, or what happens to you will be considered an unfortunate accident. This is your only warning. She burned it in the candle flame, watching the threat turn to ash. But sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of battles she'd never fought and voices calling her name in a language she'd never learned. Deep in the castle walls, where stone met shadow and ancient corridors twisted like labyrinths, Lyra woke to the sound of whispered voices. She pressed her ear to the wall panel beside her bed and heard them clearly, nobles plotting in the secret passages she hadn't known existed. The king is compromised. He defends her even after she showed her power. Elric confirmed the prophecy. She is lumen-bound, which means she'll destroy us all if we let her live long enough. The feast. It has to be during the feast. Make it look like she couldn't handle the attention, that her mortal heart simply gave out. And if the king investigates, let him. By then, it will be too late. Lyra's blood ran cold. They were planning to kill her. And from the sound of it, they planned to do it soon. The great hall had been transformed into something from a nightmare dressed as a dream. Hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows across vaulted ceilings. Tables laden with delicacies, some recognizable, others disturbingly not, stretched the length of the chamber. Crystal goblets caught the light like captured stars, though Lyra tried not to think too hard about what dark liquid they contained. And everywhere, dressed in their finest silks and jewels, the vampire nobility of Umbrahel gathered to witness what the court was calling the presentation of the mortal bride. Lyra stood at the chamber's entrance in a gown they'd provided, deep midnight blue that made her skin look luminous, gold embroidery at the sleeves that caught the candlelight. She felt like a sacrifice dressed for the ceremony. Steady, Cashin murmured at her elbow. Half of them are merely curious. The other half are waiting for you to fail. And the third half, Lyra asked quietly, are waiting for you to die. He offered a grim smile. But I'll be watching. As will Rowan. You're not without protection. Small comfort, given what she'd overheard. But Lyra had made her choice the moment she'd taken Mara's place in that carriage. There was no retreating now. The hall fell silent as she entered. Hundreds of crimson eyes tracked her movement, and the whispers began immediately, a susurrus of speculation that felt like insects crawling across her skin. Doesn't walk like prey. Heard she survived a rogue attack. Unnatural. The way she looks at us. The prophecy must be false. She's just a mortal. Lyra kept her chin high, her pace measured, refusing to show the fear that coiled in her stomach. She'd learned in the past days that vampires could smell weakness the way sharks smell blood. At the head table, Aldrich waited. He wore ceremonial black and silver, his crown catching the light, his expression carved from marble. When their eyes met across the hall, something passed between them. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or warning. He gestured to the empty chair beside him. The walk to that chair felt like miles. Every step took her past nobles who leaned back slightly, as if proximity itself might be dangerous. She caught fragments of conversations that died as she approached. Shadowfen faction demands. The king risks everything for. By week's end, this will be resolved. Lyra took her seat with as much grace as she could manage. Aldrich didn't look at her, maintaining the careful distance he'd shown since the rogue attack. But his voice, when he spoke, was pitched for her ears alone. If anything feels wrong, you leave immediately. Understood? I can handle. That wasn't a request, Lyra. Before she could respond, Servants appeared with the first course, and the feast began. Music filled the hall, a quartet of musicians playing instruments Lyra had never seen, producing sounds that were beautiful and somehow unsettling. The nobles ate and drank and pretended she wasn't there, their conversations a careful dance around the reality of her presence. Aldrich made small talk with Lord Vask about border disputes. Lady Mirren asked pointed questions about whether the king intended to go through with the bonding ceremony. And all the while, Lyra felt the weight of hundreds of gazes, assessing, judging, waiting. The tension in the hall built like pressure before a storm. Then the music changed. The shift was subtle, a new melody woven into the old, a rhythm that made Lyra's pulse quicken for reasons she couldn't name. She saw Rowan's hand drift toward his blade. Saw Cassian go utterly still, his expression alarmed. Aldrich, she started to say. The musicians dropped their instruments and drew blades. Everything happened too fast. The assassins moved with inhuman speed, scattering across the hall in coordinated chaos. Nobles screamed. Guards rushed forward. And one blade, silver and glowing with enchantment, arced directly toward a young servant girl frozen in terror near Lyra's chair. Lyra moved without thinking, the way she'd moved in the Eastern Tower. She threw herself between blade and child, arms outstretched, mind empty of everything but the single, desperate thought. No, not her. The enchanted blade struck true, piercing through fabric and flesh, aimed directly at her heart. And the world exploded into light. It erupted from Lyra's chest like a star being born, golden, fierce, absolutely blinding. The radiance filled the hall with such intensity that vampires shrieked and fell back, hands over their eyes, skin smoking where the light touched it. The blade shattered against the brilliance, fragments raining like deadly snow. Lyra felt the power burning through her veins, felt something ancient and vast and terrifying wake inside her blood. She saw the hall through light-threaded vision, every shadow illuminated, every dark corner exposed, every vampire recoiling from radiance that their kind had feared since before memory. She heard screaming, couldn't tell if it was the vampires or herself. Then the light flickered, stuttered, and died as suddenly as it had come. Lyra's legs gave out. She felt herself falling, felt the world tilting sideways, felt her heart hammering so hard it might break through her ribs. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. Aldrich's face appeared above her, his crimson eyes wide with something that might have been fear or wonder or both. Lyra, he said, and for the first time since she'd met him, his voice held no careful control, no measured distance. Just raw emotion she couldn't name. The girl, Lyra managed to whisper. Is she safe? You saved her. His arms tightened around her. At what cost to yourself? I don't yet know. The hall spun around her in a chaos of voices, Rowan shouting orders to capture the fleeing assassins, Cassian calling for healers, Elric's stunned whisper of Lumen bound. The prophecy is true, and underneath it all, the terrified whispers of nobles who'd just witnessed something that should have been impossible. As darkness crept into the edges of Lyra's vision, she heard Aldrich's voice one more time, speaking words that would echo through everything that came after. Clear the hall. The feast is over. A pause, heavy with meaning. Everything has changed. Lyra woke to unfamiliar darkness. Not the absolute black of her chambers in the East Wing, but a softer shadow broken by firelight dancing across stone walls. Rich fabrics surrounded her, silk sheets, velvet curtains, the scent of cedar, and something distinctly masculine. Her shoulder ached where the blade had struck, but the pain felt distant, muted by whatever the healers had given her. She turned her head and found Aldrich sitting in a chair beside the bed, still dressed in his formal attire though his crown lay discarded on a nearby table. He wasn't reading, wasn't working, wasn't doing anything except watching her with an intensity that should have felt invasive, but somehow didn't. Your chambers? Lyra's voice came out rough. The healers insisted you needed complete rest. These rooms are the most secure in the castle. He leaned forward, and in the firelight she saw exhaustion carved into his features. The first time he'd looked anything less than perfectly composed. How do you feel? Like I was struck by lightning from the inside out. She pushed herself upright despite the protest of her muscles. The servant girl is unharmed, thanks to you. Something flickered across his expression. You could have died, Lyra. That blade was enchanted specifically to kill mortals. One cut should have stopped your heart instantly, but it didn't.
No.
It didn't. He stood, pacing to the window with restless energy she'd never seen from him before. Instead, you produced enough radiant force to fill an entire hall. You shattered an enchanted weapon. You made vampires who've lived for centuries flee in terror. He turned to face her. What are you? I don't know. The admission hurt more than her wounded shoulder. I've never done that before. Not like that. But you've done something like it. It wasn't a question. Lyra pulled the silk sheets closer, suddenly feeling exposed despite being fully clothed. Small things. Flickers of warmth when I'm frightened. Dreams of light and shadow. My parents. She stopped, the grief still sharp after all these years. They died when I was young. I was raised by an elderly woman who told me stories about bloodlines and gifts and warnings I didn't understand. She said my family name was dangerous, that I should hide what I was. And what are you? Before Lyra could answer, the chamber door opened. Cashin entered, followed by Elric carrying an armful of ancient texts. Both looked as exhausted as Aldrich, as if none of them had slept since the feast. She's awake, Cashin said, relief evident in his voice. Good. We need to talk. All of us. Elric spread the texts across a table, his scholar's hands reverent on pages that looked ready to crumble to dust. The lumen bound, he began without preamble. 500 years ago, there existed families who carried light in their blood the way vampires carry shadow. They weren't mages or priests. They were simply born different. Born dangerous to our kind. The Valemont line, Cashin added quietly. One of the oldest. One of the most powerful. Lyra felt ice spread through her chest. That's impossible. My family were farmers. Your family were hiding, Elric interrupted gently. For good reason. When the war came, when vampires and lightbearers fought for dominance of these territories, entire bloodlines were extinguished. The Valemonts were believed to be wiped out completely. His gaze held sympathy. You are, as far as we can determine, the last. The words settled over her like a shroud. The last. Hunted before she was even born for the crime of existing. Rowan has been interrogating the captured assassins, Aldrich said, his voice carefully controlled. One of them finally broke. And Lyra forced herself to ask. The order came from within the court. 3 noble houses, including the Shadowfen faction. They knew what you were before you even arrived.
His jaw tightened.
My own council brought you here knowing you'd be targeted.
Why?
The betrayal tasted like ash. If they wanted me dead, why summon me at all? Because prophecy is like any weapon, it can be wielded or destroyed. Some on the council wanted to control you. Others wanted to eliminate you before you could become a threat. And a few. Aldrich's crimson eyes found hers. A few hoped you might be exactly what the kingdom needs. I'm not a weapon, Lyra whispered. No, Cashin said gently. You're a person with power you don't yet understand, caught in a conflict that began centuries before you were born. The lumen-bound prophecy speaks of balance, of a choice that will reshape the relationship between shadow and light, between vampire and mortal. Your arrival triggers that choice. Elric turned pages carefully. The prophecy is fragmented, but what's clear is this. You're not meant to destroy us or save us. You're meant to offer a third path, one that hasn't been walked since the old wars. And if I refuse? Lyra met Aldrich's gaze. If I want no part of ancient prophecies and vampire politics, then you'll still be hunted, Aldrich said flatly. Because whether you choose to be part of this or not, your existence changes everything. The factions who tried to kill you tonight won't stop. They'll try again, and they'll be more careful next time. The weight of it crushed down on her, the knowledge that she'd never be safe, never be simple, never escape what ran in her blood. Aldrich crossed the room and knelt beside the bed, bringing himself to her eye level. The gesture was so unexpected, so deliberately vulnerable, that Lyra's breath caught. "Listen to me," he said, and his voice held the same raw emotion she'd heard when he'd caught her in the hall. "You are under my protection now. Not as a political arrangement, not as a prophecy to be managed, but as someone I will not allow harm to come to. Even if that means standing against my own people. Do you understand?" Lyra searched his face, looking for calculation or manipulation, but found only fierce sincerity.
Why?
"You barely know me. I know enough." His hand found hers, cool fingers interlacing with her warmer ones. "I know you threw yourself in front of a blade to save a servant girl. I know you see through the masks people wear. I know you're terrified and alone and facing threats you shouldn't have to face." His grip tightened slightly. "And I know that for the first time in longer than I can remember, I care what happens to someone." The admission hung between them, fragile and dangerous. Lyra felt something shift in her chest, not the violent eruption of light, but something quieter. A warmth that had nothing to do with prophecy and everything to do with the way Aldrich looked at her, as if she mattered. "The bond between you is already forming," Cashin observed softly. "I can feel it." Neither of them looked away from each other. In the castle's deepest foundations, where even guards rarely ventured, a figure traced symbols onto cold stone with practiced precision. Ancient words in dead languages spilled from lips that moved in prayer, or summoning, or both. And in the darkness between the words, something stirred, something vast and hungry and patient. "Umbral," the figure whispered into shadow. "The lumen bound has awakened. Soon, very soon, the veil will thin enough, and you will feast." The morning, if it could be called that in a kingdom where dawn never fully broke, brought Elric to Aldrich's chambers with more texts, more history, more truths that felt like daggers. Lyra sat wrapped in one of Aldrich's velvet robes, still too weak to return to her own rooms, while the scholar laid out the full weight of her bloodline's past. "The war of shadows and light," Elric began, his voice heavy with the burden of what he had to say. 347 years ago, the Valemont family led the Lightbearer coalition against the vampire kingdoms. It was brutal, on both sides. He showed her an illustration from one of the texts, two armies clashing beneath a sky split between sun and moon. "My family started a war?" Lyra's voice was barely a whisper. "Your family tried to stop one. The vampires were expanding their territories, turning mortals without consent, treating the living as cattle. The Lightbearers rose up to defend them." Elric's expression was somber. "But wars have a way of consuming both the righteous and the wicked. By the end, neither side could claim innocence." Aldrich stood by the window, his back to them both, rigid as carved stone. The Valemont line was systematically eradicated. Not just warriors, entire families, down to children who'd never manifested power at all. The vampire lords deemed them too dangerous to allow even one to survive. "The Vaelorian house led that charge," Elric added quietly. "Your house, cousin." The silence that followed felt suffocating. Lyra watched Aldrich's shoulders tense, watched him struggle with words that clearly came at terrible cost. "I was a general in that war." His voice was hollow. "Young by vampire standards, barely a century old, but vicious. I believed we were protecting our kind from extinction, that the Lightbearers would destroy us if given the chance." He turned slowly, and the anguish in his crimson eyes was raw and undisguised. "I led 3 campaigns against Valemont strongholds. I don't remember faces, it was centuries ago, and I've tried to forget. But it's possible, Lyra. It's possible I killed someone you're descended from." The words hit like physical blows. Lyra felt her chest constrict, felt the warmth of her power flicker in response to emotional pain. The man she was beginning to care for might have murdered her ancestors. "Did you kill children?" she asked, hating how her voice shook.
No.
Aldrich's jaw clenched. "I had lines I wouldn't cross even then. But I killed people who were defending their homes, their families. I killed people who were right to fear us." He took a step toward her, then stopped, as if he'd forfeited the right to come closer. "I can't ask for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But you deserve the truth. Lyra's hands trembled in her lap. Part of her wanted to scream at him, to demand how he could stand there after everything his people, after he himself, had done. But another part, the part that had watched him gentle with mortal servants, that had felt his fear when she'd been struck, that had heard the rawness in his voice when he'd vowed to protect her, couldn't reconcile the man before her with the general who'd waged war on her bloodline. Why did the Lightbearers matter so much, she managed. Why exterminate an entire people? Because of Umbral, Elric said. The god of shadow, who the ancient vampires served. He feeds on darkness, grows stronger when night dominates. The Lightbearers were the only force that could weaken his influence and could prevent him from breaking through the veil between worlds. He met her gaze. Your ancestors weren't just defending mortals from vampires. They were holding back something far worse. And now he's stirring again, Aldrich added grimly. Your awakening is part of it. The prophecy speaks of the Lumen Bound as a key, one that could seal Umbral away forever or provide him the power to break free completely. You need me to stop him. Understanding crashed over Lyra. That's why some of your council wanted me alive. Some wanted to use you. Others wanted you dead before Umbral could claim you. All of them see you as a means to an end. Aldrich's voice hardened. I refuse to. 3 days later, recovered enough to walk, Lyra insisted on leaving the castle. Rowan escorted her through the obsidian gates and into the territories beyond, where Umbrahel's true nature revealed itself. The land was dying. She could see it in the withered trees that clawed at a perpetually gray sky, in the villages where mortals moved like shadows of themselves, in the way darkness seemed to pool in valleys like stagnant water. And as she walked, things in that darkness stirred. They sense you, Rowan said quietly, hand on his blade. The creatures that serve shadow. Your light calls to them like a beacon, either to worship or destroy. Lyra saw shapes moving in the tree line, things with too many limbs, eyes that glowed with sick hunger. She felt her power respond, warming her blood, ready to erupt if needed. This is what happens when balance fails, Rowan continued. When shadow grows unchecked. Your family fought to prevent this 3 centuries ago. They failed. The question is whether you'll succeed where they didn't. I don't know how. None of us do. But you're not alone this time. His expression softened slightly. The king may have been your ancestor's enemy, but he's chosen to be your ally now. That matters. It did matter. Despite everything, despite the history of blood and betrayal between their families, Lyra felt the truth of it. When she thought of Aldrich, she didn't feel rage. She felt the same complicated pull she'd felt since arriving. Draw towards someone who saw her, protected her, and was willing to stand against his own kind for her. Back at the castle, she found him waiting in the courtyard. Their eyes met across the space, and without planning to, Lyra crossed to him. He caught her hands, his cool touch steadying. I can't forgive what was done to my family, she said quietly. But I can see that you're not the same man who fought that war. You've carried the guilt of it for centuries. That doesn't absolve me.
No.
But it means you understand what's at stake now.
She squeezed his hands.
Help me stop Umbral. Help me make sure what happened to my family doesn't happen to anyone else. Something fierce and grateful passed through his expression. I will. I swear it. Around them, the castle watched. Nobles whispered in alcoves, some with fear at the mortal who'd brought light to their halls, others with something close to reverence, as if she might be their salvation. The kingdom was fracturing along new lines, and Lyra stood at the center of it all. That night, Elric burst into the council chamber, his face ashen. The boundary is weakening. Umbral is rising faster than we thought. We have perhaps a week before the veil tears completely. His voice shook. And when it does, the shadow will consume everything. The first sign came at midnight, a crack that split the sky above Blackthorn Tower like lightning frozen in place. Through that fracture, darkness poured down in ribbons that moved against the wind, that consumed starlight, that made even vampires pull back in instinctive fear. This wasn't the natural darkness of night. This was something older, hungrier, fundamentally wrong. Lyra felt it in her blood, a pulling sensation, as if something vast and ancient had turned its attention toward her specifically. The warmth in her chest flared in response, defensive and desperate. "It's beginning." Alric breathed from his position at the tower observatory. "Umbral is breaking through." Across Umbrahel, the land responded to its god's awakening. Shadows grew solid, forming barriers that trapped mortals in their homes. Creatures that had hidden for centuries emerged from forgotten places, drawn to the promise of their master's return. And in every village, every outpost, every corner of the kingdom, people felt the creeping terror of something immense and inevitable approaching. In the castle's training courtyard, Aldrich worked with Lyra by candlelight, trying to teach her control over power that neither of them fully understood. Her light erupted in unpredictable bursts, sometimes a gentle glow, other times an explosion that left them both gasping. "Feel it before it manifests," Aldrich instructed, circling her with the patience of someone who'd trained warriors for centuries. "The power doesn't just appear, there's a moment between intention and release. That's where control lives." "Easy for you to say. You've had 300 years to master your abilities." Lyra's frustration leaked out as another uncontrolled flash that made Aldrich wince and shield his eyes. "I've had 300 years to make different mistakes." He moved closer, his hands hovering near her shoulders without quite touching. "Your power responds to emotion. Fear amplifies it, anger makes it volatile. What calms you?"
Lyra almost laughed.
"Nothing about this situation is calm." "Then find something. A memory. A person. Anything that grounds you." His crimson eyes held hers. "What makes you feel safe?" The answer came unbidden, "You do." But she couldn't say that, couldn't admit that the vampire king who'd once been her family's enemy had become the one thing in this nightmare that felt solid and real. Instead, she closed her eyes and focused on the memory of his arms catching her when she'd fallen, the fierce protection in his voice when he'd vowed to keep her safe. The warmth in her chest stabilized, becoming a steady glow instead of an explosion. "Better," Aldrich murmured. "Much better." Rowan's discovery came at dawn, or what passed for dawn in a kingdom where true sunlight never reached. He dragged 3 bound guards into the throne room and threw them at Aldrich's feet with barely restrained fury. "Traitors," he spat. "Paid by the Shadowfen to report on the mortal's movements, to sabotage her training, to ensure she'd be unprepared when Umbral came." His hand tightened on his blade. "They've been feeding information to whoever's been summoning the god. Every step we've taken, every preparation we've made, they've known about it." Aldrich's expression went arctic. "Who leads the conspiracy?" "They won't say. But it's someone with access to the old rituals, someone who knows how to breach the veil." Rowan's jaw clenched. "Someone inside your inner circle." The implications hung heavy. If they couldn't trust the guards, couldn't trust the nobles, couldn't even be certain of the council, then they were fighting enemies both outside and within. Cashin found Lyra in the conservatory, where she'd retreated to escape the mounting pressure. He sat beside her without speaking, his empathic senses clearly overwhelmed by the emotional storm building across the kingdom. "I can feel them," he said finally. "Every mortal, every vampire. Terror is like a physical weight. They know something is coming, even if they don't understand what." He turned to her. "And they're looking at you. Some with hope, some with fear, but all of them wondering if the Lumen Bound will save them or damn them." "I don't know if I can do what they need," Lyra admitted. "None of us do. But you're not facing this alone." His voice was gentle. "Aldrich would burn the kingdom down before he'd let harm come to you. Surely you've noticed." She had. It terrified her almost as much as Umbral did, the depth of feeling growing between them, the way she'd begun to need his presence, to seek his counsel, to imagine a future that extended beyond this crisis. That evening, Aldrich called an assembly of the full court. Nobles packed the throne room, their whispers a susurrus of anxiety and speculation. When silence fell, Aldrich stood before the Night Throne with Lyra at his side, a deliberate choice that made statements clear. Umbrahel faces its greatest threat since the founding of this kingdom, Aldrich's voice carried absolute authority. A god seeks to break through the veil and consume us all. At this moment, we cannot afford division or doubt. He took Lyra's hand, the gesture visible to every noble present. Lyra Valemont stands under my personal protection as the future Queen of Umberhell. Any who move against her move against the crown itself. The hall erupted in gasps and protests and shocked silence. But Aldrich wasn't finished. She is lumen-bound, carrier of light, and possibly our only chance at survival. You will show her the respect her station demands, or you will answer me personally. Later, alone in his chambers, Lyra confronted the fear she'd been avoiding. You'll be there, won't you? When I face Umbral. When everything comes apart, Aldrich pulled her close, his arms solid and sure around her. I'll be there. I'll stand between you and that god if I have to. That's what I'm afraid of. Her voice broke. Aldrich, I can't. If something happens to you because of me, then it happens protecting something that matters. He tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his eyes. I've lived 3 centuries, Lyra. I've ruled kingdoms, fought wars, survived more battles than I can count. None of it meant anything until you arrived and made me remember what it feels like to care about something beyond duty. She kissed him then, desperate and fierce, and he responded with centuries of loneliness finally breaking. The kiss tasted of fear and hope and the impossible bond forming between shadow and light. The tower bell shattered the moment, ringing an urgent alarm. They pulled apart and ran to the windows. Above Blackthorn Tower, the veil had torn completely. Darkness poured through like blood from a wound, and within that darkness, something massive stirred. Eyes opened in the void, thousands of them, burning with sick yellow light. A presence vast beyond comprehension pressed down on the castle, on the kingdom, on reality itself. And a voice that wasn't quite sound, that resonated in bone and blood and terror, spoke one word. Lumen. Umbral had arrived, and he was calling for her. They climbed the tower stairs together, Aldrich's hand never leaving hers. Behind them came Rowan, Cashin, and Elric, the 3 who'd stood witness to everything that had brought them to this moment. The stone steps spiraled upward through darkness that pressed against them like something alive, and with each step, the pull of Umbral's hunger grew stronger. The tower platform opened to a nightmare. The sky had split apart, revealing something that human minds weren't meant to comprehend. Vast darkness that moved with terrible intelligence, that hungered with the weight of eons. Shadow tentacles as thick as castle walls lashed through the air, each one leaving trails of corruption that made the stone itself weep. Lumen-bound, Umbral's voice shook reality. I have waited centuries for your light. Come to me. Complete the cycle. Stay behind me, Aldrich commanded, stepping between Lyra and the manifestation. His fangs extended, his power rising in response to threat even though they both knew it would be futile against a god. A tentacle of living shadow crashed toward them. Aldrich threw up a barrier of crystallized darkness, ancient vampire magic that had protected his line for generations. The tentacle shattered it like glass. The impact threw Aldrich backward. Lyra screamed his name, watching him hit the tower's edge, his body smoking where Umbral's corruption had touched him. He struggled to rise, blood the color of midnight staining his lips. No, Lyra breathed. Then louder, fiercer. No. Another tentacle lashed toward her. Aldrich threw himself forward despite his injuries, putting his body between her and annihilation. The shadow struck him full force, lifting him off his feet, darkness spreading across his chest like poison. Aldrich. Lyra caught him as he collapsed, his weight sudden and terrifying. His crimson eyes found hers, already dimming. Run, he gasped. Please. I'm not leaving you. The warmth in her chest exploded outward, responding to her desperation. I refuse to lose you.
Do you hear me?
I refuse. She pressed her hands to his heart, or where his heart would beat if he were mortal, and let everything pour out. Not just her power, but her fear and fury and the love she'd been too afraid to name. Light erupted from her palms in radiance, so pure it turned the corrupted darkness to smoke. Aldrich gasped as the power flooded through him, burning away Umbril's poison, filling him with warmth he hadn't felt in 3 centuries of death. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, something fundamental shifted. Shadow and light, vampire and mortal, finding balance instead of destruction. Lyra rose, pulling Aldrich with her. His strength returned as her light channeled through him, creating something neither had been alone, a force that combined the ancient power of shadow with the fierce brilliance of dawn. Impossible, Umbril roared. Light cannot join shadow. You will destroy each other. Watch us, Lyra said, and thrust her hands toward the sky. Light erupted from her in a column of pure radiance that struck Umbril's manifestation like a spear through darkness. The god shrieked, a sound that shattered windows across the castle, and shadow writhed in agony. But this light was different from what had come before. It carried traces of darkness within it, of shadow learning to serve rather than consume. It was the balance the prophecy had spoken of. Aldrich stood at her side, his own power rising to meet hers. Where their energies touched, something new formed. Twilight, the marriage of dusk and dawn, the proof that light and shadow could coexist. The battle shook the sky. Lightning that wasn't lightning split the darkness. The tower platform cracked beneath their feet. Lyra felt herself burning out from the inside, felt her mortal body straining to channel power it was never meant to hold. Blood ran from her nose, her ears. Her vision blurred. Aldrich's arm wrapped around her waist, steadying her, sharing his ancient strength. Together, he said. We do this together. They poured everything into one final surge, all of Lyra's light, all of Aldrich's shadow, all of their combined will that this god would not claim another victim, would not consume another kingdom. The radiance struck Umbril's true form where it pressed against the veil, and for one eternal moment, the god's shriek of rage filled every corner of Umberhell. Then silence. The tentacles dissolved like smoke. The corruption retreated. And slowly, impossibly, the veil began to seal itself, reality knitting back together as if it had never been torn. Lyra and Aldrich collapsed together, clinging to each other as the last of their power faded. They were both trembling, both barely conscious, but alive. Against all probability, alive. Is it over? Lyra whispered. For now. Aldrich's voice was rough, but certain. You sealed him away. Not destroyed. Gods can't be destroyed, but imprisoned beyond the veil for another age at least. Below them, the castle emerged from shadow. Nobles appeared on balconies and in courtyards, staring up at the tower where 2 figures stood silhouetted against a sky slowly returning to its natural darkness. Some faces showed terror. Others showed something close to reverence. All of them understood that everything had changed. Cashin helped them down the stairs, his empathic senses overwhelmed, but his smile genuine. The kingdom felt it. The ceiling. They know what you did. In the throne room, the court assembled without being summoned. They came because something fundamental had shifted in the order of things, and they needed to witness what came next. Aldrich stood before the Night Throne, still bearing the scars of battle, but his bearing was pure authority. Lyra stood beside him, exhausted but unbroken, her simple dress still stained with blood and darkness. I came here expecting to fulfill an obligation, Lyra said quietly, for his ears alone. A political arrangement. A role to play. And now, Aldrich asked, now I'm choosing you. Not because of prophecy or duty or what the kingdom needs, but because somewhere between your terrible honesty and your unexpected gentleness, I fell in love with you. Something fierce and tender passed through his expression. I love you too. More than I thought this dead heart could love anything. He turned to the assembled court and lifted the silver crown from his own head. The gesture sent ripples of shock through the nobles. Vampire kings did not crown mortals, did not share power, did not bind themselves to those who would age and die. But Aldrich placed the crown on Lyra's golden hair with absolute certainty. This woman arrived as a bride I never wanted. His voice carried to every corner of the hall. She leaves this moment as the queen I will spend eternity protecting. She is lumen-bound, bearer of light, the one who saved us all from shadow. His crimson eyes swept the silent court. And she is mine, as I am hers. Let any who would dispute this speak now. No one spoke. No one dared. Lyra Valemont, last of her bloodline, looked out at the court of immortals and understood what she had become. Not a simple bride, not a weapon, not a prophecy, but a queen who had reshaped the night itself, who had proven that shadow and light could not only coexist but thrive together. And beside her, the vampire king who had learned to love again smiled.